I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up on the next episode of The Trade Guys, we are going to talk Tariff Man 2 and his tariffs on China EVs, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Guys, welcome back. And I am excited to say that there's either a new Tariff Man in town or maybe we call him Tariff Man 2. I don't know. But before we get into that, Bill, I know you had something to say about a person who was going to be our guest today, but is going to come on in a later time.
Yes. Well, I'm semi-chagrined. We announced last week with great fanfare that Congresswoman Susan DelBene was going to be our guest this week. Unfortunately, she had to cancel, and we're in the process of rescheduling. I'm embarrassed because having worked up there for 20 years, I should have known that this was likely because schedules always change for members of Congress. The House is in today, as it happens, while we're recording. But she will be back. And the next time we may not let you know so that we don't have two episodes in a row where we make a prediction and then turn out to be wrong, or at least
we're losing all of our credibility.
As opposed to all of our other predictions, which are invariably right.
The little credibility that we had is just, getting tossed out the window. Boy, oh boy.
Well, she will be back, but today we're going to have a tariff episode, as Andrew said.
Oh, man. So, guys, this was a big week in tariffs. Biden administration announced a slew of new tariffs on China this week, involving EVs and solar. And we've been talking about this stuff for a while, but it actually happened. And the first thing that came to my mind is like, okay, so who's now Tariff Man? Guys, who is Tariff Man?
Turns out it's Biden.
Yeah.
Although, the response was partisan and classic. The Republican response is always the same when Biden does this, which is too little, too late.
Sure. And
the Trump response was, well, he should have done something else. Or the Trump said, well, I would have made it 200%, not 100%. So,
or simply, I did it first. I started this.
Well, there's that too. Yes, I started.
It's kind of like a food fight in the elementary schoolyard.
Biden, the copycat, but he put a lot of tariffs on. This has been rumored for the last couple months, and I had been erroneously predicting that it would continue to be rumored right through the election.
Mm-hmm.
But they decided to go ahead, and I think in part it's because they made a political calculation that it was advantageous for them to go ahead and do what they were going to do. And I think they may be right about that, given the public mood about China.
It's shocking that they made a political decision during an election year.
6 months before the election? Who knows?
Yeah,
shocking.
Who things like that could happen?
Shocking.
But I think they've gone to great lengths over the years to try to inoculate themselves against the Republican charge that they're soft on China and soft on security. In a way, it's a page from Trump's playbook, and it's an effort to, I think, preempt things that he probably would have said on the campaign trail if Biden had done nothing. But it's also, that said, it's not the same. I mean, we can call him Tariff Man accurately, not just in jest, but it's not the same as Trump. And it's for different purposes because it's designed to reinforce the development of competitive American industries in critical sectors. The 102.5% tariff put on Chinese electric vehicles is really designed to ensure that the United States doesn't get swamped by Chinese EVs, which is what is about to happen in Europe. Maybe that's something we'll talk about.
So I'm going to translate what you just said for a minute and have Scott react to that. So what you just said is essentially not a good plan for the Biden administration to allow China to dump a bunch of EVs in an election year when you need Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin and lots of states that produce cars.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is the headline tariff was a surprise because of how high it was. The United States doesn't have 102% tariffs on goods. But the fact is, there was already a 27% tariff on these cars imported from China from our friend Tariff Man 1, Donald Trump. And that was sufficiently high to effectively prohibit the importation. So there are no Chinese EVs in America today. And raising the tariff fourfold will also lead to no tariff collections and no imports.
Well,
so.
there are some, and there's a debate about how many. Our data here at CSIS is approximately 12,000.
12,000 Chinese EVs in the United States?
Yeah, most of them are Polestar. And in fact, if you want to see one, Polestar actually has an outlet 2 blocks from CSIS Central, just down 17th Street, for those of you that are Washington listeners.
Do you think it's a spy listening station? I mean, we're sort of halfway to the White House, too, so I don't know.
No comment on that.
Okay.
So there's 12,000 vehicles out of a 17 million
Well, but the Chinese,
market.
we've had the Chinese in town this week for a continuation of what's called the Geo-Dialogue, Global Economic Order. This has been going on for something like 9 years, and it's twice a year. They come here in the spring, and we go there in the fall. And I was talking to one of them about this last night, and he said that they think there are 30,000 Chinese EVs here in the United States. I talked to our person who follows this more closely, who didn't believe it, but we ended up deciding we may be talking about different time periods. They may be talking about total, and she was talking about last year. So I don't know, but either way, it's a small number. But the tariffs are prophylactic. They're designed to prevent this from happening. So the immediate economic impact on these things is small. You know, there's not that many EVs coming in. There's a tariff on chips, legacy chips. Most of the legacy chips come in end products. They come in as part of laptops, as part of your toaster if you have an Internet of Things toaster, part of your refrigerator. The immediate impact is estimated to be $18 billion, which is not that much. But it's not designed to produce an economic impact in the short run. It's designed to prevent us from being swamped in the future by a number of things, most importantly, EVs. And I think it'll probably succeed in doing that. I mean, you can have this odd debate about, you know, how big a tariff do you need to shut them out of the market? In talking to the Chinese, they thought that Trump 60% would really eliminate all trade if he did it across the board to China. So, you know, when Biden does 100% and Trump says, well, I would do 200%, probably doesn't make a lot of difference at that level. The loser here, incidentally, I think, is the environment. And that's what, or is climate, which is what makes this kind of interesting. Because once again, this is evidence of something we've talked about in the past. The administration is pursuing contradictory goals. They're focused on the green transition and facilitating non-fossil fuel technologies. At the same time, they're focused on reshoring and building up the domestic industries. Those are at odds goals. If you want to facilitate the transition to non-fossil fuel-based technologies, you want to get as many EVs sold in this country as you can, as quickly as you can. And that would mean, exclusive of everything else, letting the Chinese cars in. And if you don't let them in, or if you make them a lot more expensive, what you're going to do is slow down the green transition. So the goals are at odds with each other. And I think most of the early commentators on this whole episode have pointed that out, that if there's a loser in this equation, it's climate policy.
Well, it seems to me, and look, I know the president and the people who work on economic policy in the administration are very frustrated by the low performance ratings the American people are giving this administration on jobs and the economy. And this announcement is kind of a microcosm of why that is in my book, because there's a lot of publicity and focus around micro issues, but the statements and indeed the program tends to ignore these very contradictions that are always present in the macro picture of things. So think about inflation, which has been one of the things that has, I think, hurt the president's ratings the most on the economy in his time in office. Well, most economists will tell you inflation was kicked off by the American Rescue Plan. It was $2 trillion of spending starting in March of 2021, just as the economy was reopening and probably overheating from the COVID shutdowns. And it was really too much money chasing too few goods that started the inflation. And now, there was never a consideration to revisit that spending. The administration was committed to the spending, committed to the program, wanted to get it out there fast. And so you had this macro contradiction between the likelihood of creating inflation and a spending program you were fond of. Then once it happens, then you've got a lot of micro things to say. It's transitory. It's price gouging CEOs. Or you announce something that is equally micro, like junk fees. We're not going to have junk fees on your hotel room stay. And voters look at this and say, wait a minute, that's not what I was complaining about. That's not the problem. So I think they unfortunately managed to do the same thing here. You've got some headline high tariffs that seem to have come out of nowhere. They're announced as not really connected to any policy or any program, because they
didn't come out of nowhere for those of us who are watching this, though. I mean,
well, we were watching, but there wasn't actually a continuation of negotiation with China on overcapacity from the original 2018 301 investigation. So that was, and then as Bill says, when you get underneath it, there are policy contrasts and contradictions that are totally unresolved. So do you want a fast conversion to electric vehicles? Well, if you do, you might want to include inexpensive electric vehicles in the American market so people can afford them.
Right, because what's the goal? To get to 50% electric by what year? I forget.
2035.
2035. So this is contradictory, as Bill and you both pointed out. But, maybe it's also not politically popular to get to 50% by that.
Well, that's a separate problem, whether the policy is popular. But you can't both get high conversion rates to electric vehicles and exclude low-priced vehicles from the market.
All right, so this is the question. How is the administration explaining this to people? And if they're trying to get credit for being tough on China, are they doing a good job at it?
I think, yes, I think they're – I kind of feel for them on this. I don't think they had a lot of choice. And this is a case where, we've seen the movie before on steel, aluminum, wind turbines, solar panels. Europe is about to face it on EVs. The Chinese have honed industrial policy to a fine art. They identify sectors they want to pump up. The state allocates credit, which means inevitably you get overinvestment, and then you get overcapacity, then you get overproduction, and then they dump it on the rest of the world. And the process of doing that, it works well for them. It creates a lot of jobs, a lot of stuff, and it puts everybody else out of business. And Biden's defense of what he's done is going to be to go to Detroit, which is the obvious place to go, and say, I've just saved your industry. Because otherwise you would be disappearing because of cheap Chinese cars. Europe is wrestling with this right now because they don't have a 27.5% tariff. Theirs is 10%. And they don't have, right now anyway, indigenous European EVs to compete with Chinese EVs. I mean, they've got, I think, Volkswagen, which is in China. I think they ship some to Europe, but that's not the same thing. That's not European jobs. So they're about to get swamped. They're trying to figure out what to do. They've initiated an investigation, which is the equivalent of one of our subsidy countervailing duty investigations. The prevailing gossip is that will be finished and put out in July. The prevailing rumor is it'll be a 25% tariff, which is the current 10 plus 15 more. Then there will be a debate about whether that's enough. I think one of the reasons why Biden did what he did now is to put some pressure on Europe to do the same thing. Because one of the other problems with this whole thing is overcapacity is a global problem. The Chinese are doing this to everybody. So, what Biden has done is he's squeezed on the balloon. And by squeezing on the balloon, you limit what's coming in here, but it just pops out somewhere else. It's because they're making all these things. They have to go somewhere. And so they'll go to Europe or they'll go to somewhere else. And the right answer, unless you can sort of persuade the Chinese through logic that this is not a constructive policy to pursue for the world, the more likely a defensive approach is make them eat the surplus. But to do that, you've got to cut off all the avenues of export. So you've got to get the Europeans to do the same thing. You've got to get everybody else to do the same thing. And if you can get the significant markets, then you might be able to, force the Chinese to pull back and pursue different policies. But they're doing it in part because they do this every time they have an economic problem. They try to export their way out of it. And we keep telling them.
This would have been an argument, Bill, for coordination with the Europeans.
Yes, but I think
which to my mind there wasn't any. And in some ways, we're doing the same things the Chinese are on, say, legacy chips. Part of the CHIPS Act is we're essentially subsidizing the construction of facilities which will, in sum and substance, be legacy producers. Meanwhile, we know what overproduction of legacy chips looks like. It was the DRAM chip business that became completely unsatisfactory for Japan and Korea, along with the United States and not Micron.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting debate, though. That I think we've had a couple private sessions here at CSIS on what's going to happen in that sector. There's a lot of people in the business, and I mean, there's division. There's no unanimity on this, but a lot of people that are work for chip companies believe that the idea of being swamped by Chinese legacy chips is overblown. And it mostly has to do with your assessment of future demand. The argument that this is a phony issue is that Chinese demand for the same chips is going to grow so much that the additional fab plants that they're building will break chips that will all be soaked up by Chinese demand and be exported.
Domestic demand.
That ignores the question of all the people in the West, Intel being a good example, who are selling these chips to the Chinese right now. And if the Chinese essentially adopt an import substitution strategy where they start using domestic chips instead of ours, or instead of Infineon's or somebody else's, then the question is what happens to Intel's chips and what happens to Infineon and what happens to them. So I don't entirely buy the argument, but it's not quite as obvious as it is with EVs about what's going to happen, because there's a very large and healthy demand for legacy chips. These are the chips that go into cars, and that go into Internet of Things and that's not really going to change in the short run. And EVs, I think, or connected automobiles, meaning automobiles connected to the Internet, have even more of these things in them. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Maybe we can go back and think about Europe in the context of what have we been doing and what should have we been doing? Because we have this unfair practices investigation that goes back to the previous administration. We have some work by the Trump administration, but clearly this investigation was on the desks of the people of the Biden administration.
Which one are you talking about? The China one?
The China one, yeah. Okay, and we knew the threat, and we knew it would be better off coordinating with Europe than not. It doesn't seem like there's been any coordination in the 3+ years. What have we been doing, and what should we be doing?
I think you get a flavor of the problem if you look at the green steel and aluminum negotiations that we've been having with Europe, from which are now in their third year without result, and we've punted until after both elections, the European election next month and our election November. So the next deadline is March of 2025. But that really, from the American point of view, that's about Chinese overcapacity in steel and aluminum. Right. The Europeans are more worried about climate implications, green implications. They want greener steel. We want to be exempted from their border adjustment program, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure. They don't want to do that, partly because it would open the door to everybody else wanting to be exempted. And it would open a very complicated problem of calculation, because we haven't in this country put a price on carbon. And if you're going to assess, basically what a CBAM is it tells importers, to the extent that your import is dirtier than our domestic product, you have to pay for a tax on the additional carbon that is embodied in your product. But that means two things. One, you have to measure the carbon, and there's not an internationally agreed upon means of doing that. And you have to have a price then. Once you've measured it at so many tons, whatever, then you have to price it out. And that relies on each country to do that. We don't do that. We don't have a price. This administration hasn't supported one, which probably doesn't make a lot of difference because the Congress wouldn't pass it anyway. But the administration is trying to argue that to the Europeans that they should accept a regulatory approach to decarbonization rather than a tax-based approach to decarbonization. And I think the Europeans, really don't want to do that. And one of the reasons is it's much harder to quantify decarbonization if there's no price. So the negotiations are stalled. We can't deal with overcapacity successfully with the Europeans. I think in the beginning, they were not as upset about China as we are. They've been coming around slowly. And depending on which country you talk to, some of them are a lot closer to us than others. I think the Germans are farthest away. I think there's others that are closer. Then there are some that are much closer to China in a lot of ways. So I don't see near-term results here. I wouldn't say we haven't tried, at least in that context. Mm-hmm. It seemed to me from the beginning there was a deal that could be cut there, but neither side seems willing to give in at this point. So we kick the can for another year, almost another year.
So I think to Andrew's original question, we have two tariff mans now.
Two.
It's a pretty popular role.
Yeah.
Nobody's playing free trade man at the moment.
Well, so guys, what is China's response to Tariff Man 2, Joe Biden, levying these tariffs this week?
They're outraged. They're very upset. They're pounding the table.
Okay, so they're shouting, they're outraged, but what are they really going to do?
Well,
how are they going to retaliate?
They always retaliate, so expect something. They don't always do it right away. When we did our export controls in October of 2022, it took them about 6 months to figure out what they wanted to do because they try to do things that will hurt us and not them. And when our economies are intertwined, and they still are, we ship them. I mean, the total trade is in the 700 billion camp collectively. With that much going back and forth, there's a lot of, we have not decoupled, let's put it that way. So there's things that doing things to us is going to hurt some of them. I think there's three things they'll probably look at. One is what we did, just higher tariffs on things that we sell them, pick a few. And they tend to try to match us in terms of value. So if ours is 18 billion, you should expect them to do 18 billion. So one thing is just higher tariffs. Another thing is buy less agriculture products. That's what they did with Trump's tariff. They shifted their soybean purchases to Brazil. And
I remember that.
That is complicated politically because produces a sharp reaction against the administration in farm country. Trump's response to that was basically to subsidize U.S. farmers and pay them money to hold them harmless from the money they were losing on unsold soybeans. So the Chinese could play that game again. Or probably the most likely thing is to find some more critical minerals that they'll refuse to sell us. We talked about gallium and germanium last fall when they put controls on that. And my bottom line was, inconvenient but not fatal. I think the one that we're a little worried about right now is graphite because
graphite would be a big
because we don't have very much, like 1% of our need. And they've got a lot. I mean, they're not the only place that has graphite, but
who else has it?
That's a good question. I don't remember offhand.
There are some allies, Australia, Canada, but it's the majority of the production and usable materials through refining is from China.
You can also make it synthetically as well, but
yes,
I think cutting off natural graphite all these things produce rather significant short-term supply interruptions. And then, companies do what they're good at. They figure out ways to work around it. And there's a new normal down the road, but it's a more expensive new normal. So what'll happen is there'll be confusion and a lot of anxiety and table pounding, and then prices will go up and the conversion to domestic batteries will slow down if they do that.
Oh boy. So we're gonna have to wait and keep guessing until something actually hits.
It's a mess. Yes.
Yeah, and I don't. They haven't done anything. Well, I mean, it's been 3 days, so they haven't done anything yet. And it may not be, as I said right away, because anything they do, even if they stop selling graphite, that means their companies, their mines take a revenue hit, and there are job consequences for that. So if they switch soybean producers, it may cost them more. It depends on where they go. It depends on how tight supplies are and whether they can find what they need. My impression is, and listeners can call in or write in and tell us that we're wrong. My impression is the Chinese are having a somewhat better year agriculturally on their own right now, which gives them a little bit more flexibility. They're not going through a period of massive drought or other weather events that have disrupted the crops there. I mean, too soon to say because a lot of this is harvested in the fall. So we'll see.
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to see. And in the meantime, does the Biden administration get any credit for this?
Good question. The early reaction from labor, steelworkers were positive. I think the UAW was positive. Actually, most people have been, even the ones that are sort of detached from it, have been sort of in the mode of, well, that's probably the only thing you could do if you wanted to save the industry, the auto industry. And most people want to save the auto industry. It's a lot of jobs, and it's not just direct jobs. There's the whole supply chain thing, and it's the community library, it's the bars, it's all the infrastructure that supports a big plant in the community. That's all at risk if we get swamped with vehicles. So I think there's a feeling I was talking to someone yesterday who normally opposes tariffs and was concerned and was supporting these, and because she thought it was basically the only choice. Was a little nervous about being tagged as tariff lady, but so I'm not going to mention any names. The one negative comment came from the pork producers because they're at the front line of agriculture. They have significant pork sales to China, really significant pork sales for them. I mean, it's a significant part of their overall export profile. And they're nervous because if the Chinese stop buying our pigs or our pork, that's going to be a problem for them. So they're unhappy.
So me and Scott are going to have to start ordering double bacon, is what you're saying.
Barbecue yes. every night, and
yes, right.
stock up.
It is a challenge, but I accept.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm right there with you. Right there with you.
And unfortunately, because many of these tariffs are postponed, or the highest tariffs are on goods that have limited presence in the current market. I won't say they're no presence, but limited presence. Bill mentioned that it was a relatively small effect. What I think that means is the Team Biden gets very little credit for this, or not sufficient credit to change the overall views of the president's economic policy. So I don't think it's going to help them with voters. It may help them with some industries. And I think Bill's right that if you're in an auto industry, you've got to do something to keep it in business.
It can't hurt for those swing voters in Michigan. That's for sure.
No, it'll help in Michigan. Right. It'll help in Ohio, which may not make any difference, but it'll help.
Yeah. I said Ohio earlier, and then I was thinking, gosh, Democrats really just don't have a chance in Ohio anymore, really.
Well, other than Senator Brown, they've been closed out of statewide offices now for a couple of cycles. So
yeah, but I'm optimistic about him, aren't you?
Sherrod Brown?
Yeah.
He's never lost a race, so I don't know why he'd lose this one.
He's all out or all in, I guess would be the better phrase, on trade. In fact, his response to what Biden did was unusual and interesting. His response was not good enough. We should just ban the cars, period.
Just ban them. Yeah.
And
well, I wonder if it comes to that. Does it come to that?
If you think about the economics of it, there are Chinese cars, EVs right now selling for $10,000 US. So 100% tariff would be what? $20,000 US. That still puts them way, way below a Tesla. On the other hand,
I mean, there is no car that's $20,000 anymore unless it's something, from 1975 that barely moves.
Well, exactly. But on the other hand, the other question is you have to look at the demand question. American demand is still, I think, largely light trucks and SUVs. That,
Correct.
the $10,000 car is a cheap mini compact, and there's a market for it here, but not the biggest one. And then you get into sort of market analysis, and it appears the U.S. companies, meaning primarily Ford and GM, are much more interested in sort of meeting the market where it is. That is SUVs and light trucks. The Ford 150 electric is a good example of that.
I think my next car is a Ford SUV.
Well,
it makes some very competitive vehicles.
They sure do. And, the thing is, guys, though, I still have such a hard time envisioning Americans driving Chinese cars. I know you guys pointed out that we didn't envision driving Korean cars 15, 20 years ago, and now they're some of the best cars on the market. I just don't see that with Chinese cars somehow.
They are universally regarded as of very good quality.
Yes.
That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. There's something like 150 Chinese automobile manufacturers. And we were talking about this at this dialogue yesterday. Our China economic scholar, Scott Kennedy, was in China and visited with one of the companies that's going into this business. And he said, there's going to be a shakeout. 150 separate car manufacturers is unsustainable economically, which I think is right. So there's going to be some bankruptcies or some mergers or something. And they asked the one company and said, well, how do you deal with that? And the response is, well, that's going to happen to all the other guys. It's not going to happen to me. And I think all 151 of them say that. But there is going to be a shakeout in the industry. There's going to be bankruptcies unless the state bails them out. What the Chinese have historically tried to do is force mergers and consolidate them that way, or divide them into, you guys make this kind and you make that kind, so you don't compete with each other. But it may just let some of them go belly up because there's just too many. And some of those are then.
Well, look, in 1920, there were dozens of American car companies.
Well, and see where we've ended up.
We ended up with two.
Do the ones that go broke were the ones with the worst quality, or they were ones who were out of sync
in some
with
cases they were the ones that were the highest quality and highest level of engineering. Duesenberg went belly up. Auburn went belly up. Cord, one of the most innovative cars ever. All of them, and it was the Great Depression.
When I was growing up, one of my mother's friends had a Studebaker, which was unlike any other car that you'd ever seen because it was low and sporty looking and
South Bend, Indiana,
completely different from anything else. And I just was fascinated by it. But then they went, they're gone. They're all gone. So you'll see a shakeout in the industry, but the survivors, there'll be high quality products. Now, there's the further question, which I think Andrew was kind of implying, which is, do people really want to buy a Chinese car, given the way that people feel about China right now?
Correct.
And the answer to that may be no.
Well, I think we'll find out.
Yeah.
They don't mind buying Chinese phones.
Don't mind using TikTok.
Right.
So anyway, guys, this is a great discussion. We have another Tariff Man in town. It's exciting too. And I wish both of you a terrific, terrific rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.